Great. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining this talk, which I'm really excited about. So for LGBTQ History Month, which is now a month ago, we wanted to focus on learning from communities outside of a Western context. And I think Palestine as a first event is a really interesting example for that. Because, well, for example, people are in a situation where they're juggling different parts of their identity in the context of conflict and occupation. And in that sense, your identity can become political without you even wanting that to happen. So please welcome Adam today. When I talked to Adam about this event, it became evident that he would be able to talk about it from a lot of different angles. So as a freelance researcher, he has, for example, studied online identities and trust in online platforms among Palestinians. And as an activist, he has worked with the organization Al-Cause that is especially giving perspectives to young LGBTQ plus people. And also from his experiences and his work, he can give us some insight into how gender and sexuality can be understood in contrast to a Western understanding of it. So thank you, Adam, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yeah, when Annabelle and myself started talking about this talk, we were really puzzled at the beginning about what kind of angle I'm gonna showcase about Palestinian gender and sexuality in the context of LGBT and queer activism and experiences. We were, at the beginning, we were thinking about going about discussing personal narratives, discussing part of the research that I did. But eventually, after a lot of thinking, I've decided to go with something a little bit introductory about Palestine, because I don't know how familiar the crowd would be with the context in Palestine, the colonial, the social, the economic, the political. And then from there to go and delve into more deeper analysis and showcase about how sexuality and gender dynamics prevail and how they intersect with a lot of systems of oppression and domination. So I'm going to give out a general introduction about Palestine for anyone who's too familiar, and then go from there. And hopefully at the end, if anyone has any questions, I will be happy to answer them. So beginning with Palestine, I don't know how familiar you guys are with Palestine or the situation or the history of the place. But Palestine has been battling colonialism across centuries now, and has been characterized by political, social, economic, and geographic instabilities. Since the very beginning of the 20th century, and even by the end of the 19th century, a lot of British and Zionist colonialists began to settle in Palestine, forging changes in the land, and enforcing power dynamics that are still unfolding until this very day and influencing our lives until this very day. So the notion that Palestinian society at the time had no modernist or urban infrastructures and the Zionist narrative of making the desert bloom do not only erase centuries upon centuries of Palestinian historiography, culture, heritage, and society, but they still pose limitations to various Palestinian discourses and movements from emerging or progressing due to the very material rupture during the Nakba, which is the Exodus of 1948, and the ongoing settler colonial project that still permeates every aspect of Palestinian life until this very day. Now, with this very harsh physical and material occupation of Palestine that has been in praxis for over 70 years now, and the rupture in the social fabric of our nation, whereas almost 1 million Palestinians fled and became refugees in neighboring countries and abroad, and the ongoing displacement and fragmentation, other arenas and aspects of Palestinian life and psychology continue to be affected tremendously. And in our case today, we're going to focus on the sexual politics and gender dynamics and how they are affected by this rupture and this ongoing colonialism. So it is not really a secret that colonial and harsh military realities complexly intersect and influence sexual and gender dynamics in any society, for that matter. There is sufficient research and colonial studies that have discussed these dynamics and how sexuality and gender intersect with colonialism, and for example, in North Africa, Central Africa, Central Asia, and in Southwest Asia, where Palestine is. But the situation in Palestine is still not in a post-colonial context. It's an ongoing dynamic that is being unfolded. It's very much in the making. But Palestine is very much a great example of the complexity of how these things intersect. So in this talk, I will try to give out a general social, geopolitical, colonial, as well as cultural frameworks to somewhat lay out a foundation for anyone who's not too familiar with the situation in Palestine today. And later I will delve into a more elaborate showcase and explanation of how the contemporary feminist and queer Palestinian movements have emerged, what are the core beliefs and outputs of these movements today. And as such, I will try to attempt to situate the current status of LGBT and queer communities in Palestine, where we stand in terms of our struggle and where we are headed. Now, beginning with the geopolitical reality, historical Palestine today is quite fragmented into shrinking geographical islands that are being constantly under a threat of erasure. Palestinians living in Palestine 48, the West Bank, Gaza, and other informal lands are continuously battling colonial oppression. And there are ongoing obstacles in having a sense of collectivity as a people and as a society due to many of us living in presumably so-called different political and social realities, but that is only how it appears above the surface. It is true that different areas in Palestine are governed by different authorities or groups, yet all of these localities and geopolitical constellations are still subordinate to Israel's colonial domination. They function under Israel's approval and according to Israel's allowing limitations, which logically enough only serves the de-radicalization of Palestinian society and the liberation movement, and the maintenance of the Zionist domination of the land. So the entirety of Palestine is colonized by Israel, constantly making changes in the geography, constantly limiting the accessibility of Palestinian society to one another, as well as to the land, to resources. A lot of house demolitions are happening, and they happen throughout various methods. So for example, in Sheikh Jarrah nowadays, there's an ethnic cleansing that is happening in East Jerusalem. A lot of houses are being demolished. A lot of houses are being attacked by settlers. And a lot of people are losing their homes. In Palestine 48, people might lose their houses because they didn't have a legal administrative paper that permits them to build this house on their land. But that's not really how it happens, for example, with other Jewish groups in Israel. So there's this kind of ongoing dynamic that it's still unfolding on a daily basis. And many of us as Palestinians feel as if we are refugees in our homeland and as if we are aliens. There's a sense of alienation a lot of Palestinians feel in their indigenous environment. So that that colonial context, that very harsh military reality is happening, while Palestinians nowadays very much lack a legitimate authority. There's a lack of leadership, which leads to a very mistrusting and weary attitude towards any authority or government or ruling power in general, regardless of the location and the geopolitical constellation. So consequently, due to the cuts and fragments in our society, in the collective, There are social and cultural differences, as well as sexual and gender dynamics that differ from one place to another. So, for example, I'm from Taipei, which is my hometown, which is in the Central District in Palestine 48. And my hometown is very much different from Jaffa, a coastal city next to Tel Aviv that is facing a destruction of urbanity, which is very different from Bir Sabah, which is a predominantly Bedouin city in the Naqab in southern Palestine, which is very different from Haifa. And all of these localities exist in Palestine 48. Yet, all of these localities very much differ from other localities in the West Bank, such as Ramallah, which very much differs from Jericho, which very much differs from Jenin or Nablus. And sexual and gender dynamics in these places also differ. The way LGBT and queer communities live and experience oppression in these localities differs. There is no particular consistency. So in terms of political realities and social realities, we do live under a very harsh colonial reality, yet it unfolds and takes form through various physical formats that eventually all serve the same purpose. Now, socially and culturally speaking, Palestinian society is a historically more secular society than it is a religious one, despite the fact that it is noted to be the Holy Land or the land of the three Abrahamic religions and other religions. It is an Eastern society initially that values collectivity over individuality, one that throughout history preferred autonomous governance and regional self-sufficiency over national unified governance, which is one of the reasons why it was so easier to colonize, so easy to make changes in the land throughout centuries. So, taking that element, and due to the lack of trust in any ruling power, as well as the absence of any legitimate leadership in the region, that has been an ongoing state for over 30 years, which approximately began during the first Intifada and lasted until this very day, but really unfolded after the Oslo Accords in 1993. So there's this absence of leadership. There's this reality. There is this reliance on social structures. So we build and we often rely on and build smaller collective systems that facilitate as support systems for social or economic or culture and sometimes even political needs. So we facilitate family structures, for instance, non-governmental organizations, local movements, and even relations that are based on living in the same locality or village, such as being part of an agricultural village, in order to solve collective and individual obstacles and issues. We really rely on these structures in order to solve challenges. So our society is one that highly values social and familiar relationships. And when I say familiar, I do not only refer to the nuclear family structure, but rather a body that includes quite the extended family, such as aunts, uncles, grandparents, and even further relations for many. So it's, for example, to give something more concrete, it is still very much expected of children to visit their families on a weekly basis if they live outside of their family's home. It is still very much expected of individuals to live with their parents if they do not leave the house to settle down or get married. It is still very much a topic of discussion if a young adult seeks to establish their life independently away from their parents and family, if what the individual is searching for can be provided by the family, such as financial security, money, support, housing, and so forth. So in that context, individual choices oftentimes bear a heavy weight of what the collective might have to say, regardless of the fact of what the consequences might be as a result of a choice that is not really favored by the extended collective. And for that matter, family and parental choices are also very much influenced by the wider collective's opinions and thoughts. And that collective can be a neighborhood, it can be a social class, colleagues in a workspace, and more. So not only do individuals care about the collective's opinions, the collective cares about the wider collective's opinions. And this is some sort of an ongoing dynamic within our society. So, decisions on issues concerned with individual freedom, for example, personal expression, particular demeanors and behaviors, and of course, gender and sexuality and gender and sexual visibility, can be very much judged in a collective manner. And there are opinions that can be heard casually about a person's personal choices. So yeah, opinions and choices are very much influenced by others. But yet again, many Palestinians, because of that strong familial value, still reach a state of understanding with their environment, even if there is a political or social or cultural or religious difference. The family values and the collective values are still very much valued. So there is a process of dealing with these things rather than cutting these ties if there is a difference, most of the time. In an LGBT and queer context, LGBT and queer Palestinians do face challenges disclosing who they are and coming out in the Western sense to their families, but it is not an issue that cannot be discussed or accepted or talked about. The only thing is the fact that these issues cannot be more visible to the public. So for instance, many LGBT and queer communities do disclose who they are and do have a normative, a normal, healthy relationship with their parents after a process, of course, rather than becoming disowned because of who they are. But there is a lack of visibility for these things. So take all of these dynamics into consideration and try to understand how a regular Palestinian individual, a heterosexual, cisgender Palestinian, navigate their lives in Palestine, and then think about the LGBTQ community in Palestine with the extremely complex reality that we navigate through. The social and political structures of power always affect the most marginalized. And the LGBT and queer community faces such an interlock of structural oppression that makes the issue and challenge of leading a non-cisgender or heteronormative lifestyle and path not merely a way of living that is solely based on individuals' gender identity, sexuality, gender expression, etc. Now, LGBT and queer Palestinians have always existed in society. And the fact that we constantly have to remind everyone, as well as ourselves, of this fact is just an example of how much erasure we are combating in general by different sides. On an inter-community Palestinian level, LGBT and queer folks are not widely accepted in the public visible sense, or more accurately, the visibility of LGBT and queer people is not widely accepted. Non-normative sexual practices are not visibly widely accepted. Talking about sex and sexuality in general, to begin with, is not something that is too common in the public sphere, although within families and other collective structures, things can be discussed and talked about freely within certain frameworks, but not in a public social level. And that has a lot of reasons that are also concerned with mistrust and fear that the Palestinian society constantly lives by, of exposing something to the public that might be used against us. So it's not really that simple either way. Many LGBT and queer Palestinians are still leading respectable lifestyles where we do find, for example, Palestinian queers who are out in the Western sense, who are very much integrated into local economies, for example, and community structures. We can find business owners, cultural producers, activists, teachers, and even community leaders who are queer and practicing their queerness. And as such, there are a lot of Palestinian queer folks who are uncomfortable in being who they are, who are actually facing emotional and sometimes physical violence because of their gender expression and sexuality. So these dynamics are not unique to Palestine, and they are prevalent almost everywhere in the world. LGBT and queer issues are very much a topic everywhere, but the queer Palestinian movement and queer politics and queer organizing and queer activism really discuss these dilemmas without separating and dissecting society and self into separate classifications and groups. So we don't really discuss gender and sexuality as if, okay, so we are a community, we are an extension of society, we discuss these things separately, we discuss other things separately. No, we discuss everything about gender, sexuality, being Palestinian, living under colonialism all together, because we cannot separate identity. We cannot choose to wake up one day and be one thing and the other to be another thing. And it has been the most sustainable and logical approach to do so. So talking about the Palestinian queer movement, Palestinian queer movement is actually fighting for Palestinian liberation in general, but not only in a national sense, and not only within the anti-colonial struggle for Palestinian liberation, and not only for gender and sexual liberation. So the queer Palestinian movement, for example, and the widespread the Palestinian discourse in Palestine is one that views any form of oppression towards any community as an oppression towards the entirety of society. So if we as a society seek to be a liberated, healthy society, we cannot have any form of oppression practiced against a group, a community within our society. We have to be a resilient, strong, healthy, liberated society on every aspect and for every group, regardless of who we are. And that has been the leading discourse of the Palestinian queer movement. And that movement, logically enough, has emerged from the local context of Palestine. I know that to many that discourse might sound radical and very intersectional, but because the political and social reality is so complex, the Palestinian queer movement automatically adapted that kind of discourse of discussing every structural oppression and systematic violence all together. And the Palestinian queer movement has emerged from the local context eventually. The queer organizing in Palestine in an organized manner began after the Second Intifada, immediately. A lot of grassroots queer movements began to emerge, particularly in Jerusalem and Jaffa at the time. And because the colonial reality was very strong, it was quite absurd for queer Palestinians to only go and meet to discuss their gender and sexuality while ignoring the separation wall that was being built at the time, for example. So the intersectionality of the discourse was really coming into formation because of the very material reality that was unfolding at the time. So that being said, in Palestine, where laws, legislations, as well as administrative factors are not what really make the difference for Palestinians, where laws and governments are mistrusted, what does a law, for example, an international law, a UN violation of a law, do to a Palestinian that is facing displacement? How a law in 2021 is something that people really count on, Palestinians particularly, and also elsewhere, when people are facing systematic and institutionalized oppression. So for that reason and many others, the Palestinian queer movement shied away from a rights-based discourse and struggle, but rather tried to work out preconditions that need to be addressed in order to achieve a healthy and liberated society in the longer run. And that really became the mainstream discourse in Palestine. So talking about the challenges of the LGBT and queer community and what the movement tries to achieve and battle and challenge. What do we, as LGBT and queer Palestinians, face? What are the challenges? How does our reality help us, limit us? Within the Palestinian society, we work to dismantle patriarchal structures that oppress non-heteronormative or cisgender individuals. We have to dismantle toxic masculinity that oppresses every individual in our society, mainly women, femmes, and queer and trans folks. Additionally, nowadays, and after 70 years of settler colonial occupation and erasure, LGBT and queer folks are working tirelessly to understand how Palestinians, and particularly LGBT and queer Palestinians, have internalized colonial propaganda about us as Palestinians and about Palestinians living with diverse gender and sexual practices. So the Palestinian movement and the queer Palestinian movement aims to dissect the Palestinian gender and sexuality and the dynamics of these elements that have evolved over the last 70 years, and what do we, and tries to figure out what do we need to unlearn in terms of false self-perceptions as a society in order to liberate ourselves also from the colonized state of mind. So the colonial project and the Israeli international affairs have continuously, for example, used false and non-comprehensive comparative methods between Palestinian society and Israeli society in order to frame Palestinians as backwards, regressive, and incompetent, contrary to a liberal, progressive, and open Israeli society. And it often uses topics and incidents concerned with LGBT and queer issues as a way to push this analogy further by framing Palestinians as conservative and therefore unworthy of liberation or any form of freedom for that matter. And as such, Israel continuously promotes itself and Tel Aviv in particular as a haven for international gay communities, as a method to shift the attention from from the war crimes, the occupation, the besiegement of Gaza, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and all of the wars that it has been committing. Now, all of these tactics do not only serve the Israeli international affairs and the image of Israel, but they deliberately harm and oppress Palestinian LGBT and queer Palestinians and stagnate and limit Palestinian queers from organizing. And it deliberately harms the entirety of Palestinian society. It doesn't only harm the image of society, but it really harms the entire social fabric of society. For example, in an analysis paper that Al-Qaws for Sexual and Gender Diversity have published recently, they discussed pinkwashing and further showcased their framing of this policy. And the paper, analysis paper is called Beyond Propaganda, Pinkwashing as Colonial Violence. I can send it to you, or through a simple Google search, you can read their findings. But in that analysis paper, Al-Qaws expanded their understanding of these tactics as ones that harm the Palestinians' collective's psychology by continuously portraying us as incapable of change or progress. And as it makes many queer and non-queer folks internalize this belief that they can either be queer or Palestinian, and that the only option is choosing between the two, that you can never exist as a Palestinian queer individual. Now, as Palestinian queer folks, we are mostly, by definition, not accepted within Israeli homogeneous society and spaces. So if a queer person, or any person for that matter, seeks to be in a safe, to an extent, environment in an Israeli society and space, they would have to give up their Palestinian identity, language, and politics in order to assimilate into a colonizer's culture. So in a way, this creates a division, a conflict within society through exploiting non-normative gender and sexual attitudes by facilitating these issues only as a tool to divide wider Palestinian society, which is, for example, right now there are the fourth Israeli elections in the last 2 years. And the main topic has been within Palestinian parties running for the Knesset has been the issue of LGBT and queer issues. Um, and the discussion was in Israeli news outlets about how one party is conservative because it has an unclear stand towards issues of LGBT and queer rights. And the other party was liberal because it had members that were supportive. And this kind of division exists elsewhere, not only in this kind of dynamic, but that's just a very contemporary example that is happening now in real time. So Palestinian LGBT and queer communities are not only a tool to divide, they are also being very much dehumanized. Another interesting, they're being dehumanized, which is, I can give another example. In a research that I have done with my research partner and lawyer, Shahrazad Audi, we interviewed over 100 LGBT and queer Palestinians ages 18 to 37, who were from various regions in Palestine, regardless of colonial borders. And they were ones who were a mixed group of activists and individuals who were not engaged in activism. So there were a lot of findings in this research. But one of the most astonishing findings was the fact that the research was basically about online gender-based violence towards LGBT and queer communities. And in the research, we asked the participants questions about how they behaved and how they monitored their identities on online platforms. And over 77% of the participants mentioned that they do monitor parts of their identity, specifically parts concerned with their queer identity, for two reasons. The first was caring for their family because they didn't want society to judge their parents and siblings and nephews. And the second was the fear of sharing personal information concerned with their queer identity because it might be used by Israeli authorities against them as queer individuals. Now, regardless of how much these reasons are realistic fears and to which extent these fears come to life, these findings reflected a very interesting complexity and intersectionality of being a queer Palestinian in Palestine, and the fact that many political and social aspects necessarily interlock when a decision to live visibly is at stake. So, going back to the Palestinian queer movement, the Palestinian queer movement seeks to really give importance to discussing LGBT and queer issues, sexual and gender dynamics, and sexual politics in Palestine through a radical intersectional lens. The contemporary Palestinian queer movement is mainly led by individuals and activists such as El Cause for Sexual and Gender Diversity in Palestine, which is a queer anti-colonial and anti-capitalist organization working on a national level, alongside Aswat Freedoms, which is a group of a feminist group for sexual liberties, and in partnership with other intersectional feminist movements such as Talat. And all of these movements are national movements who are working in different regions in Palestine. Community building, academic activism, social, cultural activism. And the discourse and work that is being done is all about creating spaces for the marginalized queer communities. Network and partner with different social actors in Palestine, and to expand the knowledge with regards to these issues in order to empower LGBT and queer folks into taking agency over who they are, over their environment, as well as build a liberation discourse and strategies that strive for a radical transformative justice and change that seeks to reach a liberated Palestine while everyone are liberated from economic, political, social, patriarchal ability, and colonial oppression. Nowadays, where LGBT and queer issues stand, there has been quite the shift throughout the last 3 years, where there has been a rise in LGBT and queer visibility in Palestine by Palestinians. For the first time, Palestinian queers in 2019 took it to the streets and organized a Palestinian queer anti-colonial protest, calling for the end of violence, any form of violence towards any Palestinian, anywhere. And it has been an ongoing struggle that seeks to, in one hand, educate and lead a liberation discourse that not only talks to wider Palestinian society, but also elevating the liberation discourse in Palestine to realms where any movement, regardless of what the struggle the movement is trying to combat, integrates intersectional and radical liberation discourse. And yeah, that's in short about the Palestinian queer movement and about sexual and gender politics in Palestine. I just would like to note that it's very crucial to discuss these dynamics through an intersectional lens, because gender and sexuality in the Palestinian context are very much complicated, and they cannot be discussed through one lens while ignoring the other. And I would be happy to answer any questions and open this for discussion if anyone may like that.
Thank you so much, Adam. If anyone has a question, you can just either raise your hand or put it in the chat, or maybe write in the chat that you want to ask a question. Let's see.
I feel like I talked so much.
Yeah, it was a lot of input, but
yeah, I feel that.
Well, I can start maybe. I was really interested in what you said about avoiding rights-based kind of achievements. What do you think are the goals instead of like achieving specific rights? Because we talked about it in one of my courses that I had, and it's we were talking about cultural versus more material kind of movements, and how achieving certain rights or material ends on the one hand, or striving for a more broader shift of discussion. What do you think should be achieved, and are there any more institutional changes that are also that people try to achieve as well?
Yeah, this is a very interesting kind of topic also in the Palestinian context, because regardless of LGBT and queer issues, there's always a discussion within the liberation movement whether it should be the struggle for the right to return or the struggle to return. And it has been a very interesting discussion that seeks to radicalize the liberation movement beyond having rules that allow a Palestinian to return to their homeland, but rather giving the Palestinian the freedom to choose if they want to return or not. Now, in the LGBT and queer and feminist discourse and movement in Palestine, there has been a very unstable governing and authoritarian reality. realities shift, geopolitical realities are constantly changing. I mean, there is a Palestinian Authority, but when did surrounding Palestinian reserves with a wall and giving limited privileges to an authority become state building? There is no state building happening at any point. So having a rights-based approach will not solve the issue. It would be very aesthetic. It would be very much something that would happen legally, but would not be really practiced socially and politically. So the work that the queer and feminist movements are doing is to advocate for feminist and queer values, for intersectional values, to work with the sheer belief that Palestinian society, regardless of their field of interest, is actually capable of progression and change, rather than work to achieve a legislative or a lobbying kind of accomplishment. So yeah, but that's what I think about the rights-based approach. But then again, when the society really believes in equality, in justice, in transformative justice, in any theory of change for any community, automatically there will be laws that protect communities. But when there is a law, you don't really guarantee that a society or a group of people is actually protected. And in the Palestinian context, having a law that protects people people don't really believe in the law, because the law have failed them so much, and because there is no legitimate authority or government that actually people feel they can really rely on in order to solve their issues. So yeah.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I'm just going to read the first two, and then we have two more. So the first one is from Fahad. He says, thanks a lot, Adam. I have a question about the intersectional approach of Palestinian queer movement. How has this approach and movement been received by the wider Palestinian liberation activism networks? And then the second question is from Nico, and he asked if you could say a bit more about the relationship between the queer liberation movement and the Palestinian Authority, including potential repression.
Okay, so I will start with Fahad's question. Basically, the only movement that has been leading an intersectional liberation movement on a national level has been the Palestinian queer movement. So, for example, I, as a Palestinian living in Palestine 48, being an activist in queer spaces has really connected me with a lot of other activists in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem and in other rural areas in Palestine that I could not really access as a Palestinian. And I could have formed these connections only through queer activism and not through any other framework that I was involved in. There is no movement in Palestine, up until recently at least, that has been an intersectional movement that advocates for a general kind of a more transformative liberation other than the queer movement. And actually, because of the involvement of a lot of people in this movement, whether they are queer or not, whether they identify as LGBT or not, a lot of people have formed connections and values that they have practiced outside of the movement. So, for example, there is a national feminist movement that has emerged in late 2019, which is a very eventful year in general for Palestine in terms of queer and feminist organizing. And that movement is called Tal'at. And Tal'at was the first feminist movement in Palestine to form a mobilization of women in various regions of Palestine that advocate for the end of violence against women, the end of violence against Palestinians, and the necessity to liberate, and the fact that Palestine can never be liberated unless all of us as women and other minorities are liberated. And on September 26th, 2019, in Haifa, for example, there was over 1,400 women marching and occupying the streets. And at the same time, on the same day, marches were happening in Rafah in Gaza, Jaffa, Taibe, Ramallah, Beit Lahem, Berlin, Beirut, Bir Sabah, Shfa'amir, and Nazareth. It was a national movement that emerged all of a sudden, and that movement actually mentioned that they were inspired by the queer movement's discourse of not having a rights-based approach because they were sick of the NGOization of feminist mobilization in Palestine, and they seek to establish something different. So for many movements, the queer movement and the cause in particular has been an inspiration to think about new ways of mobilizing and new ways of leading liberation discourse. So I hope that answers your question, Fahad.
Okay. We have
Nico.
more questions coming up. Okay, Nico's question. Do you remember it or do you want me to read it again?
The queer liberation movement and the Palestinian Authority. Up until 2019, there was no actual relationship between the queer Palestinian movement and the Palestinian Authority. Because the Palestinian Authority in general is not very active. It doesn't really do anything. It's very limited in resources, and it's not really an authority that Palestinians rely on for any matter. But there has been an incident where Al-Qaws had organized an event, a panel discussion in the city of Nablus. And the event was a public event. It was posted on Facebook and people were attending, showing that they were attending the event. And at the same time, the same organization, Al-Qaws, have posted some sort of an announcement that they were going to hold a queer camp. But the queer camp was not announced. The whereabouts about the queer camp were not announced, the time, the location, nothing. So the Palestinian police, the Palestinian Authority police spokesperson issued a statement that this group, Al-Qaws, was conducting illegal actions in the holy city of Nablus that has a lineage, a religious and historical history. And there was a lot of incitement towards the organization. And that has been the only time there was a relationship between the PA police and the queer Palestinian movement. Now, because of what happened at the time, a lot of violence suddenly emerged against visibly queer people everywhere. There was some sort of rage towards Palestinian and queer folks as a result of that spokesperson's statement, and it really ignited a lot of violence towards the organization and towards queer people in general. As a result, Al-Qaws did not back down, and they worked with a lot of local Palestinian human rights organizations, partners, feminist movements, collectives, psychological committees, even nurseries, who have all stood in solidarity with the cause. And they have pressured the Palestinian Authority to withdraw the statement. The Palestinian Authority said that the spokesperson of the police acted on his own mind, and that it did not reflect anything. But that happened only behind closed doors. They didn't issue a statement saying that. And the statement was deleted, but there was no accountability. The Palestinian Authority didn't hold itself accountable for the violence that it caused LGBT and queer communities afterwards. And it ended there and then. There was no progression interaction, but the fact that this incident happened, it situated queer politics in a new kind of position where queer individuals and queer issues are very much dominant and visible and present in the Palestinian mainstream discourse. It was reported about the issue in numerous news outlets. It was widely discussed, and suddenly queer issues and issues of gender and sexual diversity became a hot topic as a result. And it didn't really go down since then. Like, it has always been a topic ever since that is on the rise. Yeah. More questions.
More questions. So, do you want to read two more or like one by one?
I don't mind answering questions.
Okay. So Anthony is commenting that your input on pinkwashing was really interesting, and how he wanted to ask if the queer liberation movement also resonates with people in Israel. I'm going to skip Faad's second question, but let's answer this.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I don't think that I could reference the research that I've conducted with Shahrazad that I mentioned earlier. That, for example, a lot of high-profile Palestinian queer individuals who are artists, musicians, culture producers who are very much in the public eye, content creators. We interviewed also people who work in these fields, and they have discussed the fact that whenever they post something about their queer identity, integrating the fact that they are Palestinian, whether the Palestinian flag is incorporated, whether they discuss themes of liberation, etc., they were always faced with comments on online platforms that dehumanized them, that told them that if you were in Gaza, you would die. If you would do this, then you would die. But there was never some sort of an acceptance to the fact that a visibly Palestinian queer person in Jerusalem, the West Bank, would be so confident and so articulate about their political and social thoughts. Now, individually speaking, there are a lot of Israeli allies who do believe in anti-colonial theory and in pinkwashing as a tool that erases Palestinian LGBT and queer experiences. But in the general organizing sense, there is almost no actual activism that advocates for these issues. There was a few Israeli anarchist queer movements that have emerged also after the second intifada that advocated for the end of occupation, the end of the siege on Gaza, the liberation of LGBT and queer individuals in Palestine, and the fact that the Israeli pride is only a cover for the heinous crimes that Israel is committing. but that movement kind of disseminated with time, and the people that actually agree with or believe in the Palestinian liberation movement are functioning as individuals who believe in that, but not as a collective that actually advocates for these issues nowadays, at least.
Thank you. Next question is from Echo, and she asks if you could introduce a bit more about some specific practices of the queer movement. You mentioned protests, if there are any other ways of activism happening, especially anything that's more specific to the Palestinian context.
Yes, so the Palestinian queer movement works on many scales and levels. There's a lot of advocacy that is being done with different organizations, social movements, and groups. For example, there is a lot of training for educators and teachers at schools in Palestine that is done by the queer movement and organizations, particularly Al-Qaws and Aswat. There's a lot of workshops that host LGBT and queer people, and these workshops are a framework for people to explore their gender and sexuality further and to try to understand their experiences and frame them in within social and political frameworks. There are a lot of cultural and artistic initiatives that are being produced that discuss Palestinian gender and sexuality. Panel discussions, support groups. So yeah, it really happens on many different levels in order to influence and affect different sects of society. But also in terms of activism in a less organized, organizational, NGOized manner, most activism within queer circles is done on the basis of mutual aid and solidarity. So this principle is mainly the leading compass for queer activism in Palestine. People really look out for each other when there is a need. People really rise up to the occasion. If a queer person needs some time off because of a certain violent reality they want to escape, because of they want someone to talk to. So yeah, it's very much active on different realms, on different levels. Not only protests.
Okay. One more question from Tal, who's wondering how you think movements in the West for Palestinian liberation and for queer liberation can better support the Palestinian queer liberation movement or combat pinkwashing and Israeli colonization.
I think the best way is to first of all give platform for Palestinians to tell their own stories rather than allow other people to speak about Palestinian issues. There's a need to highlight Palestinian narratives and Palestinian perspectives about Palestine. And there's an absence of Palestinian voices when it comes to talking about Palestine and Palestinian experiences in general. Like mostly Palestinians organize frameworks for themselves to talk about their own perspectives, but other organizations, other movements don't really give that platform for Palestinians. Listen to queer Palestinians when talking about queer Palestinian issues. Follow Al-Qaws, follow Aswat, and follow queer activists on online platforms and see what they have to say about the realities and about the way they are dealing with being queer and being Palestinian. Solidarity is very important. Talking about the issue, like I believe that people should, in general, not just with regards to this issue. I believe that people should be having uncomfortable conversations with their environment and with their surrounding about issues of social and political injustice. So yeah, it's mainly advocating for these rights, giving the people their platform, highlighting Palestinian perspectives, and also realizing that the queer Palestinian movement is an anti-colonial movement that is asking for a liberation for all of Palestine and not only for queer or LGBT communities, because the two things do not contradict each other. Yeah.
There are two more questions, if you want. One is about a bit different question, about when faced with external pressure to choose between identifying as Palestinian or as LGBTQIA+, how do activists navigate understanding their identity?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but people, I mean, people normally, queer activists, Palestinian activists don't really get to choose whether they choose to be Palestinian or queer. Some individuals choose to totally disregard their Palestinian identity because they are living in such a hectic emotional entanglement where they cannot really fathom that they are colonized individuals who don't really have any representation for their experiences, and they choose to completely disregard their Palestinian identity and live as queer. But that is part of the larger problem of how pinkwashing and colonial policies affect LGBT and queer issues. Like there's a lot of people always feel the sense of that they don't really belong, that they don't really know someone that looks like them, that someone that faces their own issues and challenges. And sometimes the solution for such a heavy kind of situation is to assimilate into the colonial society in order to not deal with the heavy weight of combating oppression. But that is a very rare case for Palestinian queer activists. Like most Palestinian queer activists do not divide their identity. They can't really do that. Even people who choose to assimilate still face oppression. It's not the fact that if you assimilate into a society and you totally disregard your Palestinian identity, you're going to stop facing colonial oppression. It is a result of colonial oppression, and you will continue to face colonial oppression. But a person will simply choose to not really confront it or take an active role in combating it.
Yeah, sorry, just have a quick follow-up. That was actually my question. I mean, I think that like, so I'm from the US, and like in like kind of these movements, there's often like a huge like debate between like kind of adopting different identities and identity politics, even within like a queer liberation movement, and people like get really heated over like how like they will like I don't know, like different approaches to that. And I think that like it's kind of interesting because it makes it a very like kind of multidimensional and like divided movement. So I think something really interesting that stood out in the talk to me at least was when you were saying that people like the kind of criticism that the movement faces is that like people who are like people are forced to be like not feel like they can't be Palestine and like queer at the same time. And I feel like that's something that doesn't really happen, at least in the context that I come from, but I feel it could be like a divisive pressure within that movement itself. So I was just super curious to hear about that. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. yeah, in that kind of sense, I mean, the way that identity politics take form in the US is very different from elsewhere in the world. Like, I feel like the US is very much enshrined in identity politics, and usually big cities where there's a very kind of diverse mix of people from different backgrounds, identity politics really take form, and people really start to discuss their issues only through the identity, which in my opinion it only limits the conversation from progressing. But in the queer Palestinian context, funnily enough, it is less focused on identity. Like, even the movements, they don't really like name that we are a movement for gay and, but they talk about like sexual and gender diversity, or Aswat, the feminist center for sexual freedoms. Like, they don't lump their struggle, a struggle that is based on identity, but they lump that we discuss a struggle that is based on an experience that anyone can feel, regardless if they are LGBT or queer or cisgender or heterosexual. Because we all face gender-based oppression, we all face sexual oppression. But some people face it in more complex and harsher ways, and others have it easier. So in that sense, identity politics in that kind of context do not really exist, or exist in a very minimal presence in the movement. But when it comes to, for example, the Palestinian identity, so a lot of Palestinians do discuss and do enforce the fact that they are Palestinian, but that is coming from a place of reassuring the fact that Palestinians still exist, rather than playing the role of identities in contrast to other identities. It's more like Palestinians in general, we did use Palestinian as a way to describe us being part of a collective throughout history. I'm talking about like over 200 years ago, but it was never a national kind of movement. Like, Palestinians would be, for example, in northern Palestine during Greater Syria, Palestinians in Haifa and the northern Galilee were very much aligned with Greater Syria's politics, but they were Palestinian. During Dahr al-Umar's reign and autonomous rule of the Galilee, Palestinians and Lebanese people were under that autonomous kind of authority or regime, but people identified as Palestinian in a more of a sense in being part of a collective. But only after the British Mandate and Israeli Zionist occupation, the Palestinian word started to become more of an identity, and it started to be used in a way to maintain and enforce the fact that we exist, we cannot be erased, this is our struggle, this is our history. You cannot continue saying that this land was empty, you did not make the land bloom, it is not the land. It is somewhat a reaction to the phrase that Palestine was for the land who were without people, who came to the land without people. So it's very much a reaction to that kind of notion or idea. But we didn't come from nowhere.
Thank you so much. That was super cool.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have one question left. If you still have breath, if not,
Yalla.
Yalla. Okay, it's from Fahad again, and he was interested in how has the intersectional queer movement been received by other authority structures and institutions, like religious institutions or political institutions within Palestine.
The question is about the queer movement. How has it been received by other institutions?
Yes, so kind of linking back to religion, maybe.
So yeah, personally, I do not. I don't think I'm fully equipped to answer this question, because, for example, there are a lot of LGBT and queer Palestinians who are religious, and they choose to maintain their religion and their queer identity. Now, as a discourse and as a form of organizing this this kind of intersectionality between religion and sexual and gender identity did not really emerge in Palestine. It really emerged in other places such as London, for example. There's a very strong queer Muslim community there, and they're very visible about that, as well as New York, for example, really big cosmopolitan cities. But in the Palestinian context, there is no discourse that discusses religion and sexuality and gender identity and gender expression within the same kind of framework. Funnily enough, I've discussed this with a friend of mine a week ago, and she is a queer person who is a daughter of a very religious sheikh. And she was telling me about how she really lacks a discourse. She's very thirsty for a discourse that integrates religion and sexuality together, because, for example, her father views religion through a very spiritual lens rather than following a doctrine or a book or a rule. And therefore, he very much accepts her queer identity because of that approach that he has. He thinks that God has created everyone in a perfect way, and therefore, whatever you are and whoever you are, it's okay because God created you that way. And now, in the wider Palestinian context, religion does not, like religious groups, organized groups, do not accept gender and sexuality, and religion is very much used as a way to combat any discourse about gender and sexuality and gender and sexual diversity. So yeah, there is no general acceptance of this topic by religious groups. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
I think so. And yes, Fahad says yes. And thank you. I think this brings us to an end. Thank you so much for this really rich and fascinating talk. I will definitely think about it more afterwards and revisit the topic. I was wondering how people could reach out for more materials or resources. Maybe I could put my email address and then coordinate, or
you
directly.
Everyone can use mine. It's totally fine. I will be beyond happy to share any information and resources that I have. And also, if people really want to acquire academic and more theoretical knowledge about issues of sexual and gender diversity in the Palestinian context, you can check out Al-Qaws. I'll write their name down. Sorry, that wasn't Al-Qaws. That's Al-Qaws. Jadaliya also share a lot of, it's an academic journal. They also share a lot of studies, texts about colonial studies, and they also have colonial studies that discuss gender and sexuality. There's also Aswat Freedoms, and there's also a Lebanese website called Geem.me. It's more focused on narratives and stories and queer reflective perspectives and reflections rather than academic knowledge. But it could be insightful for a lot of people to learn about different experiences from the Lebanon, Palestine, Syria. Yeah. And anyone can contact me and I will send whatever I have, because sharing is caring.
Do you want to put your email in the chat as well for
Yeah,
people?
thanks.
Oh, I'm going to stop sharing now.